I am Tom Telford. Welcome to the Lift and Make Lighter podcast. I'm here with Clair Mellenthin at Wasatch Family Therapy in their beautiful office. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming.
Clair, start off by telling us a good story. I just want to hear a good, positive story, whether with a client. You don't have to mention names, obviously, but tell us a good story of what you've been up to recently.
So the last couple of months have been kind of a whirlwind since our last podcast together. I'm like, where to even start? There's so many good ones. I think actually, I had this moment yesterday with one of my little guys that I've been working with for the past several months. And it's just been so fun watching his light turn back on. So when he first came in to work with me, he was so depressed, so angry, so hurting, so sad. He just was this little Eeyore. And like you could see the rain clouds, like
Second
just
shoulders.
everything, and just so shut down to the world. And, I was laughing with his dad yesterday because I'm like, he is like one of my favorites. And he's like, it's probably because you had to work so hard. I'm like, that may be true. It took months and, weeks for this little guy to come out of his shell and like trust that, our relationship could be safe and like a safe space for him. And I watched him come in yesterday and, his shoulders are back. He's sitting up, like totally engaged and talking to me and just looking at like where we've come. And it was fun because I was having him kind of, reflect back on that too. We're kind of just checking in about like, wow, like you look different. Like you feel different, you look different. Like, where are you in here? And so we were kind of like doing some like rating skills of like how he saw himself and like his ability to articulate where, when he first started, it was just head down and like maybe a glance up, maybe if I was lucky on a good day, like that's when I knew like we were making progress. It would look at me for a second. And for him to be able to say, like, I think I'm like 7 out of 10 happy right now. And I still have like sad feelings that come in and we were able to talk about that. But for him to like put these things together and have words around it. And he was just up and chatting and, just, it was a totally different kid, coming into my office from where we started several months ago. And I just like, those are the moments in my work where I'm like, everything, all the hard things that we go through, like this is what makes it worth it. And just watching like kids find themselves again and find themselves maybe for the first time and how they see themselves has shifted. And then it's just, he still has some road work to be working on and like some big challenges that he's facing. And he's one of those kids where I'm like, you're going to be okay. Like he's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And I think like those are like the moments where I'm like, everything that I do, like, this is why it's worth it.
There's so much that goes on in the mental health space right now. I mean, the lines are long, hard to get in. It's a challenge. There's so much negativity typically that's out there surrounding the mental health space. I wanted to start with a positive story. So thank you, because that is the crux of being in the industry, is making a difference. Oftentimes, we hear about the negative implications and some of the hard challenges that are going on, but therapists and clinicians are still making a difference in the lives of people, despite all of the challenges that exist, whether that's burnout or are you getting paid by an insurance company or not? Like there's some heavy stuff going on to be a career clinician and mental health professional today. And yet there's still such big hearts who are helping people. So I'm curious, just if you don't mind, to go a little bit further, tell us the backstory of this guy, this little guy. So what was he experiencing, or what was his parents experiencing where they wanted to bring him in for help?
So there just had been a lot of big transitions. So a lot of unresolved trauma and unresolved grief. He'd had a parent who passed away when he was younger. And, his living parent, had recently remarried, and just lots of big changes happening. And I think he just got lost in himself, truly. Like, I think that, he has an awesome support system. He has all these great things, and just nowhere he got lost in there, and I think that this is one of the hard things, like with, working with kids, especially because like all the right things can be happening in your life. You can have a good support system. You can have awesome parents. You can definitely have the opposite of that happening too. And hard things still happen. Mental health issues still exist. Like, you can do your very best to like parent away whatever it is that's coming up, and it doesn't change for your little one. And as a parent, there is not a worse feeling when your baby is hurting and you can't change it for them. Like, it doesn't matter how old you are. Like, we were just kind of laughing about like our adult kids of like this whole new world of parenting.
Yeah.
When your baby's hurting, it is the very worst, most helpless feeling. And I think for so many parents, it's like, hey, I'm doing all the things I'm supposed to be doing, and this isn't getting better. And it's such a helpless, hopeless place to be in. Um, and so a lot of my work is not just with the individual kid, because I firmly believe that we cannot expect lasting change to happen if we're not working with the system and working with people who have the ability to make change happen, which is the adults. Um, and shifting in that attachment relationship and how we're connecting and finding each other in the midst of hurt and pain. And, and so I think that that's one of the things, like when you're talking about like, how do you stay, how do clinicians stay in the field? I mean, first and foremost, we have to buy what we sell and seek out our own support. And I'll be the first one to say, like, I am so grateful I've had good therapists that I go to over the years, because there's no way to stay in this field and not experience burnout and secondary trauma and compassion fatigue. Like, we do really hard work and really heavy work all the time, and you wouldn't notice, right? Because we don't have like the calloused hands that show the
Yeah.
lifting and that kind of stuff. But I think that, like that's finding your support systems as a therapist is so important, so that you can be a support system to the clients that you're working with. And I think, when you're working with kids, again, like if you're just working with that isolated kid and not working in conjunction of the relationships that they have or the lack thereof, or if you're just focusing on the behaviors and trying to change behaviors, like you're never going to get that kid,
Yeah.
So
Say more about that in particular, because you alluded to the system.
Mhm.
So describe system and how the individual is, to a large degree, their healing and their capability to go through therapy and have lasting outcome is largely reliant upon the system being addressed. So for a lot of people, they may hear that and not necessarily know. I'm married to a therapist,
right.
so I know how often, people kind of drop their kids off at therapy and like, well, go in and get fixed.
Right.
And there's this whole other world out there that's, outside of the therapy office, which is the family unit or the system or, the relationship. So describe that and maybe even get into the family of origin, what that means.
Yeah. So, okay. So when we're talking about the system, we're not, going into like the matrix, although sometimes it can feel like that. Throw this pillow behind my back real fast. But what we're talking about is, so each of us are like our cog in a clock. Like some of my clients have never seen the inside of an old clock, which dates us, right?
Yeah.
But when we think about like the wheels in a clock and how all the little spokes in the wheels turn the other wheels, right? This is how our relationships work, and how these wheels are moving within the system and then between this people in your system. So when we're talking about a system, we're talking about, you have like your family system, which is your primary one. And then beyond that, though, you're looking at like, hey, there's community, there's culture, and looking at where are these lifelines of support? Who are, like when we're thinking about working with kids, for example, where are our safe grownups? And sometimes it's not happening in the system as we know, right? Like in the family system. Luckily, most of the time, statistically, we are. But we do know that, sometimes we have to be looking outside of the
Yeah.
biological family for like this sense of security and safety to be established. But so if we're looking at, let's say, this 5-year-old who's being brought to therapy, and you're only working with the 5-year-old and expecting the 5-year-old to be the change agent of how the whole system works, like what an unrealistic, irresponsible responsibility to give to this little 5-year-old. Because that 5-year-old is the least powerful, most vulnerable person in that family. They do not have the power to make change, right? And so if we want change to happen, we need to be working with people who do have power to make change, which is the grown-up, right? Like the adult caretaker or that parent figure, whoever that is. And so when we're thinking about like in child therapy, right? Oftentimes kids are sent to therapy because they're doing something that is bugging the adults or concerning the adults,
Yeah.
right? It's usually based on a behavior, not always, but usually, right? Something is happening that is causing distress. And so then if you're like, okay, go fix my shed. I'm great over here, that that is easy to feel that way as a parent. Especially when you're like, I'm doing all the things, like I'm trying to do all the things. Like I'm reading the books, I'm listening to the podcasts, I'm going to the PTA meetings, like I'm doing all the things and it's not getting better. And I think that, in our last podcast, we talked a little bit about this, but collectively, there's a lot of shame in that. Like I can't parent away whatever it is that is happening right now. And so if I can't parent, my parenting isn't good enough. That goes directly into some attachment injuries of maybe I'm not good enough and maybe my love's not good enough. And maybe, right, like I'm not worthy of love and belonging. Like I'm a terrible parent if X, Y, and Z is happening here. And so if we're only looking at this one little puzzle piece of this 1,000-piece, jigsaw puzzle, like you're not going to see the whole picture. And so this is, like why when I'm, training other therapists and speaking and writing, like this collective approach, a systemic approach is so important because sure, that 5-year-old acting out behavior does impact and bug everybody. Like, let's be honest about that, right? It's mortifying when your 12-year-old is having a full-blown temper tantrum in the middle of Target, or your kid just got picked up for truancy again. Or your child has said that I want to kill myself and I don't want to live here anymore, right? And you've tried everything you know how to do to make this get better and go away, and it's not happening. If we're not working with those parts of the puzzle, or even addressing and looking at that, we're missing like the whole picture of what is actually happening, right? Because we're so focused on the behaviors of the identified person. And when we take that approach in our clinical work, you're going in with blinders.
Yeah.
And doing family-based work is really hard. There's a reason that a lot of therapists are like, yeah, somebody else do that, please. Right? Like sometimes individual therapy is hard enough, but if we're not looking at how these little cogs are moving each other, how they're influencing each other, how they're impairing one another sometimes, as the case may be.
Yeah.
We can't make change happen.
How often is, using your cogs example, how often is, if a child is a smaller cog, in the bigger system, how often is that smaller cog really just isolated in itself where that solely can be addressed and to have actual positive outcomes addressed? Does that make sense? Like if you just try to isolate that cog, what is the likely outcome going to be? That it's the whole watch is going to operate better if it's just addressed solely.
Empirical research shows that change doesn't last very long. In some of the recidivism studies, like, so for example, like cognitive behavioral therapy, it's kind of been like, oh, this is our evidence-based model and this is what you're supposed to use. And I'm not like dismissing, the value of CBT. But what research shows is that like with children, if you approach like a short-term cognitive behavioral focus therapy on the individual, recidivism rates within 3 years usually are back to baseline or worse. What studies have shown, if you're doing a CBT-based short-term model with a child and parent, change happens for up to 7 years and longer, because that's where like everybody's made a shift instead of the child trying to be the only one shifting.
Yeah.
And so, in a lot of research on different, therapy models, especially when we're looking at kids, we see this kind of over and over, like where there are gains that happen in individual work. And sometimes the reality is like, that's what we can do, like you may be, working at a school where you don't like, you're not going to do family therapy, right? And when you're the school counselor and the school therapist, like, so you do the best that you can in the spaces that you are. And, those who have more of that luxury of being able to have a broader approach in your clinical work, I think that that's a really important thing, to be thinking about. If I want long lasting change to happen, am I working with the change agents to make this happen?
Yeah.
So,
I like hearing that because it's helpful to just know, because I think for the most part, if we're using the child, right, as the main cog, that we're trying to address behaviorally, I have a son who, has had different challenges. And in the beginning, we identified what his challenge was. And yet we realized that for us to really have lasting change, all of the rest of us really needed to be, considered in the diagnosis.
yeah.
And what's interesting is once we all did, now the conversation shifted from him to how does everybody need to communicate in our home as a result of his diagnosis, but also my wife's, and so
Right.
the system shifted entirely. And to be honest, what ended up happening in that situation in our own family was the stress and the pressure on his cog dramatically changed, meaning he wasn't feeling the focus and the energy be him as the problem. It was now this, you use the word systemic, right? We systemically, the way that we were communicating in our home was really putting pressure onto his behavior, when in reality, it was all of us in the way that we spoke to each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, that makes sense to me, but it is hard for families to think, how are we all going to become part of it, right? I mean, it's a harder process. You have multiple people getting in, right? It's just more complex to do it that way. But I think for the most part, people want to have, like you said, lasting change. And it makes sense that the smallest cog likely has the least amount of capability to impact the change.
Yeah. And when you start therapy, it's kind of like, well, if Billy would just change, then our life would be better. Like it's so easy to go and kind of like the scapegoating, because, like, especially when it's big, overt things that you're like, okay, I can put my finger on this. Like, this is what's hurting. This is what's driving me crazy. This is what's causing the problem. It's like that old saying, like the squeaky wheel gets the grease. Like it's so true in family systems.
Yeah.
And one of the things, and so we were talking about a little bit about my research that I've been doing for my dissertation, but one of the interesting things coming out of this, and it's true, like well beyond just what I'm researching, but there's a lot of research in our field of what a bad job we do of training therapists in how to work with families. And I think that that's another part when we're thinking that about the collective system of like, hey, why aren't therapists doing the family work? Like, we know that the family's important, but there's not a systemically approach to teaching therapists how to do this, and it's not a mandated requirement in many programs. Like when you're thinking about, graduate school and doctoral programs, you maybe have a class on it.
Yeah.
But unless you're actively seeking it out, therapists could go like their whole career without taking a course on how to work with family therapy. And that's like a huge disservice to us and in our field, as well as to the communities that we're trying to serve.
Yeah. It seems like the different credentials, whether you're a social worker, whether you are a counselor, or whether you are a, licensed marriage and family therapist, the different tracks for credentialing and schooling are going to address mental health and therapy in, different ways.
Totally.
Not to mention that insurance reimbursement, if that's your practice, is going to dramatically shift just the way you approach therapy so that you can justify reimbursement from insurance companies because of like all of the things, right? I mean, the system in and of itself, is a factor there. Say more about that.
So broken.
Yeah.
Like it's so broken. And there's a reason, like that's one of the main reasons why so many therapists aren't accepting insurance anymore. Because the model that we've developed in our broader system, in our country, makes it so hard to do the work that you need to do. So a lot of insurance companies, until very recently, and there's still several, you don't get reimbursed for couples work. You don't get paid any more money for family therapy than you do for individual, even though you're doing like 7 times the work when you're like, okay, how do we get all these people in the room, and hold space and contain and do all those heavy lifting. You don't get paid any more money to do it.
So just for our listeners, as you're listening, to just share a little context of that so insurance companies for mental health therapy do not reimburse therapists if they accept insurance unless there's a diagnosis given for one individual. And so if you're a couple going to therapy for marriage counseling, one of the spouses has to be diagnosed with a mental health diagnosis in order for insurance to reimburse for that therapy visit. So even though the two of you are not necessarily there individually, you're there as a couple to have therapy to work on the relationship. The only way insurance is going to reimburse if one of you has a diagnosis. So when Claire, when you're saying, it is broken and backwards, it is. I mean, there's so much of the mental health space that is really being driven by, money, which sounds horrible, but therapists, need to be paid for the work,
right?
That what they're doing. And so, at times I think the mental health space gets a black eye for how it operates, but that is frankly the insurance reimbursement world and how it works today, which is unfortunate.
And there's a lot, and as you're saying that, like, there's so many ethical issues within that, right? Like, okay, we need help so much, so somebody has to have a diagnosis, and right?
So
like,
Tom and Liza are in therapy today. Tom is a jerk, in our marriage, and yet what do we diagnose? Tom, is there a diagnosis for being a jerk husband?
I'm sure we could find one, but no, there's not, right?
But that's
and
the
then
problem.
You see that relationship dynamic of like, see, you are the problem. If you would just get fixed, we wouldn't have the problems.
Right.
Right. And then it perpetuates that scapegoating. Or what do you do when you really need help and you don't actually meet criteria for a diagnosis? And in order for insurance to help you, to pay for the help that you desperately need, what do you do as a therapist, right? Do you fudge a diagnosis so that they can get reimbursed and you can get paid for helping them? Do you say, I'm sorry, I can't help you because ethically, like, I'm not going to give you a diagnosis that you don't have?
Yeah.
And then they can't access the services that they need, right? Like, it's so broken in how we treat mental health and relational health, because that's a huge part of mental and physical health is the quality of your relationships.
Yeah.
And we're not set up, in insurance companies to be looking at that aspect to it.
Yeah.
And addressing it. Yeah,
so
my soapbox. I could get on this like forever.
But it's good for consumers, for people who are looking at therapy and what's going on, because they may show up and be like, why does the system work this way? Why in the notes, is there a diagnosis this way? And, to be frank, that's because that is the system, that we're dealing with. And so when people think about the sheer demand of mental health needs today and how long it takes to get mental health help, they're getting on wait lists. Therapists themselves are overworked, They're fighting to just get paid, all of the things. And so it's thank you for just sharing some of the dynamics that go into, how therapy works. And
Right. And then another barrier, like just we could do 5 podcasts on this, but for a lot of families that have a high deductible requirement, they have to pay out of pocket $1,000, $5,000 before insurance benefits will even kick in, including for mental health. And so, there are these layers of systemic barriers that are part of this, and then just so people know, if you have a diagnosis, that stays on your permanent medical record as well. And that can have other rippling effects,
sure.
depending on what you do for a career and where you want to go in the future. And
Insurances,
and
applying for other insurances. Yeah.
Yep. So
when you think through, you mentioned some of the research that you're doing for your PhD and some of the disrotation work. Talk a little bit more about that, because I want to dive further into the lens that therapy is given or care is given through. So, I mean, your work that you're doing is for other mental health professionals to consider how they show up in the care and the professionalism that they're providing, the work they're doing for people. So talk about that.
yeah, so this has been something that I've been passionate about for decades, and some of our work that we do at Wasatch, we kind of have more of a psychodynamic lens. So we're looking at the world through attachment theory. And so as part of my doctoral research, so in COVID, I thought it was a great idea, I'll just go back to school and get a PhD because, just slide that in. It shouldn't be disruptive. It'll be so easy. COVID did crazy things to all of us. I ended up with all these pets and then doctoral program. It's great.
This is just being raised one of 8.
Right.
It's no big deal. Yeah. I'm married to one of these. I'm married to one of these. I'm married to this is no big deal. So keep going. I get it. I understand. No, it's not in your vocabulary. How often do you say no, Claire?
That is such a good question. I'm going to have to think on that. Because this is, yes, it is a problem. I'm like, oh, that'll be fun. Let's do that, And then,
you're welcome, Matt. You're welcome. We're going to do this right now.
Very good yin and yang. Because I say yes to everything, or when I'm like, oh, that'll be fun. Let's go on this trip. And Matt, so I'm like, so how are we going to pay for this? And have you thought this through here?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, it'll be fun. Bring on the chaos. It's great.
Totally.
It is.
It makes sense why you enjoy your partners. Yes, more, do more.
I know.
It is cool though. I love I love the let's do it. I mean, you're all in. But say more about it.
So for my research, what I'm doing is looking at how play therapists specifically, kind of narrowing down the field of who I'm studying. And that is my community, and that's who I predominantly am training and speaking to, when I am doing trainings across the world, is helping child therapists understand play therapy, but then how to bring play therapy into their healing work with children and families. And so this has been something that I've been immersed in, really for the last 2 decades. And so bringing that into my doctoral research, I'm doing a qualitative study. So it's a narrative study where I'm just interviewing and listening to therapist stories. And I am so humbled and honored, that therapists from across the nation have been sharing their stories with me, and looking at how their own attachment histories have kind of shaped who they've become, and then how they approach their own clinical work, from these early dynamics and experiences. And, there's been, several themes that have come from this, but one of the most beautiful ones is how important earned security is throughout our lifetime. And so you can come from a pretty awful circumstance and the non-ideal home, where there's trauma and abuse and a lack of safety. And as people are sharing their stories, being able to find like these outside relationships or these safe grown-ups in their life who've been able to, like, I see you, I'm cheering you on, like taking on a mentoring role, a safety role in that person, and what a huge difference that has made in their life so that they're able to now become a safe person for the children and families that they're working with.
Yeah.
I mean, it's been such a beautiful story that's been told over and over and over again from all different walks of life and different paths of life. But, you know, looking at how that shapes who you are, right? And the importance of security and safety and the vulnerability of allowing for that. I think that's another piece that comes up when we're thinking about human relationships. And, some of the other parts that have come up is when there's been a more insecure attachment history, like where you're there for me, but you're not, and I never really know who you are, and if my needs are going to be met, and
Yeah.
you kind of raised in this, anxious environment. That also really shapes who you become, and being able to manage the chaos and vulnerability that can come with doing family therapy work, for example. You know, again, all different parts of the country, such different individuals, who were so wonderful in sharing their experiences with me. And without fail, they're separating out parent and child. So I'll work with the parents separately and I'll work with the child separately, but bringing them together, that's not what I do. And so, like looking at how well we can handle vulnerability and intimacy and chaos and,
Yeah.
managing and containing all of that in the therapy room. You can't say for definitive, like, this is what caused this, but this is definitely an influence in therapists, kind of their own projection and trajectory, and like the trainings that they choose to go to, the specialties that, they find themselves in. And, across the board, a lot of kid therapists are like, I love working with the kids. Like, there is a reason and a calling.
Mhm.
If you want to work with kids and teenagers, like, it's a special kind of person that loves that.
Yeah.
Because there's lots of therapists that are like, no, thank you.
Yeah. No, I've met many.
And I love working with the kids. The parents are a different story. The parents are the hardest part of the work that we do.
Yeah.
And there's truth to that, because when you start involving more than one little cog in the wheel, all of a sudden that brings up a lot of vulnerability. And if your own attachment story has been, maybe caregivers, you can't really trust them. And, oh, you're too anxious to be in here, so I'm just going to keep you separate because my anxiety is getting triggered with your anxiety,
Yeah, there
and
we go.
it's, I mean, there's so many different factors in it. And then, the other piece of that, as we were talking about earlier, is training, and what training is actually available to you as a brand new baby therapist, your first, couple classes and what your program is designed around. And even in MFT, like marriage and family therapy programs, the family classes are usually couples therapy. And it's definitely not about how you work with little kids and their parents.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there are some specific centers and universities that do a wonderful job with that, but they are few and far between. And so as this new little baby therapist, like when we're thinking about like development, if you're not exposed to this is a possibility, or this is even how you would begin to do this, and then you're just launched out, like, okay, go run, be a therapist. And it's never been part of your vocabulary or experience. There's no requirement that you have to get outside your comfort zone and learn about it, or even that you should, right? Depending on like what model of therapy that you are trained in.
Because most of the education and the training that occur, the therapeutic alliance typically is modeled as one-on-one.
Always.
And if it's one-on-two, it's typically one-on-two adults, meaning marriage counseling.
Yep.
So it's rare and unique that the therapeutic alliance is with a parent and a child relationship.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So only one of my participants in the study had solid, like this was part of their program of family therapy, systems work. You're working with kids, you're working with parents,
Yeah.
you're working with couples, like, and just really immersed in that. And, when you think about the 1 in 10, the 1 in 100, like
Yeah.
however big this becomes, right? Like it's so few and far between to have that foundational training. And therapists have to want to find it, and they have to want to seek it out. And it really becomes up to them to create a roadmap in how to do this
Yeah.
instead of, being like, okay, here's what we do. Like, this
Yeah.
is how you work with all these different things.
So the training is rare and unique, it sounds like, in and of itself. But in terms of what the market, in terms of
Mhm.
what the community need is it, I mean, it's almost like it's the converse of that, meaning as much as the training is rare and unique for a parent and a child to be in a therapy setting together for that purpose, for that relationship. But in terms of what the community needs, that's almost all I hear about
Right.
is that there's a parent and a child, that there's a relationship going on that's challenging.
Right. And I think a lot of kid therapists are getting, there's more and more training in doing the dyad work, like a parent and child, and there's some great models out there. There's nothing about siblings and parent or parents and child.
Mm.
Or, I mean, I shouldn't say there's nothing, but that's where it becomes rare, is looking at like more than just the identified kid and their parent, of building that relationship. But much like you described, when your family got involved in therapy, it goes way beyond that, right? Because how are the siblings' relationship impacted by X, Y, and Z?
Yeah.
And the parents' relationship, if they're, two partners in a partnership, or whether they're in separate homes or together, how is this impacting their relationship? And how is their relationship impacting the problem and the child? And then this, it's like
Yeah.
the complexity of family is the part that is often overlooked and missed, right? Because it is focused on the child who's coming to therapy, and let's work on this primary relationship, which that part is so crucial. And again, it's only a couple pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. Because that acting out kid, or the kid that's hurting, whether it's like they're falling apart and falling inward with depression, they're acting out all over the place, anything in between. If there's siblings involved, there's also hurt and resentment, even though they care so much about their sibling, right? Because that kid is the one that's getting all the attention and sucking the air out of the room.
This is actually a big point, and something that I hear often. I was with a gentleman last week, lifetime of addiction, incredible story, great book, that he wrote about it. But it was interesting visiting with him. He talked about a moment where he had been in recovery now for a few years, and this huge blow up that he and his siblings had. And it was around this topic. It was the first time that he had heard his siblings actually say, you got all the attention our whole lives.
Yeah.
You were in recovery, and, addiction treatment centers constantly, and you got the best of mom and dad, and now dad's gone. And it was massive, to just hear the resentment for him. And so, yeah, this is a big deal, in terms of those who are not necessarily, quote, the concerned child, that their needs aren't necessarily being addressed. And that, in a way, is, well, they have their own version of trauma.
Mhm.
And what would you call that? Is it a lack of attention, a lack of focus? Like what?
I think for a lot of siblings, in that situation and similar ones, you feel invisible, right? And being
If I just stay
invisible,
quiet, I'm okay. Like,
yeah, but it's such a painful place to be if you feel like a ghost in your own home.
yeah.
Right? Because one of the core attachment needs that humans have is to truly be seen by another. And if you're a ghost, or you're invisible, or the sibling that, oh, great, they're in the hospital again, or, oh, sorry, I can't do that. I have to take Sally to therapy, like,
Yeah.
figure it out. You're good. Like, you guys have it. And part of this is nobody's fault, right? When you're just trying to survive and get through the crisis and keep your kid alive, like that is the hardest thing that you will ever go through as a parent, and it's nobody's fault. And if it doesn't ever get a voice and we don't ever look at that part of healing, the fallout is what you described all these years later, where, it's like, okay, the family just imploded. That was so close. Like, what in the world just happened, right? And it usually takes another crisis or a shift in the relationship dynamics for that to finally be able to come to the surface. And if we can kind of catch the families well before that time where it hasn't been a lifetime of hurt brewing in there, how much better off these family systems will be.
Yeah. Even hearing you describe this, I have to admit right now, just talking through this with you, my heart goes out to so many families who they are addressing the one, right? I mean, if the dam has several holes in it and water, like where do you plug them all, And it's so challenging. I mean, I hear often about the family systems and it's the parents are just like, I'm just trying to keep it together,
Yeah.
just trying to figure it out.
And I think that that's why, like you cannot meet all of your attachment needs of your child. You can't. Like, this is why it's so important for kids to have outside adult relationships that are healthy and can be safe, whether it's the best friend's parent or the coach or the mentor or the tutor, like other people to help fill in the gaps, because like this is a part of human life, right? Like, as a parent, I can tell you there's been lots of seasons where I felt like I was putting bubblegum patches, of like, this is how we ended up with, 4 pets during COVID. But I'm now responsible for, and I don't even really like, but that's another thing. But you know what I mean? Like, we're doing the best that we can. And I think having that self-compassion as a parent is so important. Like, we have to give ourselves space for grace in this. And you can do the very best that you can in that moment. And there still can be outcomes that are really painful, even though you were doing the very best that you could do. And you were getting the help that your family needs, and you were trying to make shifts and changes yourself and getting, this little hurting baby to like wherever they needed to go. And there can still be hard things that you have to go through, and like where you still didn't fill up the gap all the way, And I think that this is where repair is so important. And it doesn't change that hurt happened. It doesn't. But hopefully, instead of a big gaping hole, there can be, at least a scar.
Yeah.
Like where there's been some healing that have happened, like where it's like, like I use my hand as this example all the time. Like, I have these 2 little scars on my hands where my baby sister, when she was a toddler, was a little terror. And these are from her. Like, I will always know that these scars are from my little sister, right?
Yeah.
Who clawed my hand. And healing happens. Like, you can't even, unless you know that they're there, you may not even notice them. I know that they're there.
Mm-hmm.
I know what they're from, but I'm also okay, And I think that a lot of the hurts that we go through in family life and growing up, it is like that. Like, you can't prevent scars. You can't prevent hurts. You can't prevent trauma. You can do the best that you can, but there's lots of times, as a parent where I'm like, I wish I could bubble wrap you from yourself, like, let alone like the world.
Yeah.
And I know my parents felt like that about me,
Yeah.
Um,
So true.
It's amazing any of us survived this
I know it is.
stuff.
There's so much resilience, just in people.
Yeah.
But as I think about the time frame, right, we're going back to school, and in my head, I don't know why, maybe it's my own childhood, struggling in school, but there's a sense of back to school. I see commercials, ads, backpacks, pencils, markers. That's such a positive kind of, we're going back to school thing for so many families. But for me personally, going back to school was hell.
Yeah.
And so when you think about what families are now going, in the back to school phase, what do you think about as a professional in the field? Does your mind take you to, we're 30 days out from a wave? Like,
Historically, yes, we are. So October tends to be very, very busy.
Yeah.
Um,
And what will you see? What can you expect just from this added stressor of school?
I think so. Some of the things that we see on like one hand are, summer vacation didn't take away the problems that were there last year, which,
Yeah.
sometimes like there are certain cases actually where having a break from everything and a reset is just what is needed. And that is all the intervention that
Yeah.
is needed. And for a lot of other humans out there, it's not. And so for some families, it is that like, oh, yes, okay, we're back in routine. Like, we got a little bit more structure. The vampire cooking of teenagers has decreased a little bit, like the nighttime kitchen blowout. There's kind of a relief. And right now, going back to school for a lot of kids and a lot of parents doesn't feel safe. What used to be hopefully a mostly safe place is not feeling that way for many reasons. But I think, like this generation of kids that is growing up and the world that they're exposed to and the level of threat and violence that they're under all day long cannot be underspoken enough. And the fallout of this, where we had earthquake drills. The generation before us had like the nuclear disaster drills. Such good intent, and kids right now being exposed to armor intruder drills and knowing that it's not an if, but probably a when is this going to happen in my school. It's going back to school for many, many kids, it's not that relief. In some ways it is, right? And I get to be with my friends and I get to be with my teacher. For kids that have food insecurity and home insecurity, like, okay, like I can breathe. I know when I'm going to eat. I know when my needs are going to be taken care of. The Policy Project have done some amazing initiatives in our school of getting safe places for teens and bringing in washing machines and showers and food pantries, like
Yeah.
for the most insecure and disenfranchised kids, where there can be a semblance of safety. And there is this overwhelming anxiety and just threat that kids are exposed to. And we know that when your nervous system is constantly under threat, it impacts brain development, it impacts mental health, it impacts emotional health, it impacts relationships. And I think that, this is a bigger conversation than probably what we have time for today. But if we don't change what's going on in our world, like this is going to impact generations to come in really significant ways.
When you think through that, and there's a lot to unpack there. You talked, about physical safety, the harm of, violence, guns, active shooters, those things that are occurring. But there's also this other factor that is less physical safety and also just the psychological safety, that goes on. This is an entirely different set of pressures, that exist today, whether that's high expectations for grades or perfectionism or, just bullying, social, all of the stuff, that way. Any thoughts that you would share, to parents as a mental health professional? On one hand, my wife and I breathe that sigh of relief of like, thank goodness, like just get us back on a routine. So we as adults want the routine, but I do know because, I stayed up late last night studying for a biology test with my son and he had to get up, like we were studying again, like the pressure for him to now perform.
Yeah.
Right. And I know it's an education, right? They need to learn and they need to grow, but there's an element of all of it of performance. He's now on the radar screen to perform, and that pressure creates stressors. You just described it, this fight or flight response that goes on. So address that or talk through that a little bit.
Yeah, I just did a webinar for the University of Utah Pediatrics organization, across Utah yesterday on this, of how much pressure kids are facing right now and how important it is to let our kids take a break from it. So kids right now, and this is from like 3 to, way into adulthood, they are so overstructured. And in these high stressful situations, we look at preschool and kindergarten. Like when I went to kindergarten, It's like, let's play and, you know, pass some blocks and,
Yeah.
and now kids, in kindergarten are starting with standardized testing where it's perform, 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 perform. Oh, your child doesn't know how to write their name and count to 100 and, write letters already. They're not ready for kindergarten. Right? Like, I'm like, this is
I have to laugh.
bonkers.
I
This
have
is
to just
bonkers. Like
because,
what we are doing.
yeah, I'm sure I was just face down in the carpet slobbering as a kindergartner, let alone
Really?
how.
I know
So
I still had, I sucked my thumb in kindergarten, and I like it was, the pressure was not there to perform. Right. And I think the shift that we've taken in our educational realm is so counterproductive to optimal child development. Um, because it's memorize, regurgitate, memorize, perform, perform, perform. And we've put this full focus of success on test taking. And then again, talking about systems, right? Like teachers' jobs are dependent on test taking.
yeah,
And so the first things that get cut is recess, art, music, dance, PE, like
yeah,
all of these
all the things
things
that
that
create
are,
serotonin.
yes, but are crucial for child development.
Yeah, totally.
And what we're finding in research and like, I'm such a nerd, but I'm like, I read research stuff all the time. Um, and research studies, but what we're finding is there kids that are starting like in preschool with, the focus on testing, the focus on, kind of the standardized things and losing out on the importance of play and playful learning. We're finding longitudinal studies that they are at a disservice because they are not developing creative problem solving. They're not developing critical thinking. Their fine and gross motor skills are underdeveloped. I mean, this impacts the whole of a child's full development. And so one of the things I would say to parents, and I'm so passionate about this but kids need time to play. Completely unstructured free play where there's not an agenda, you're not teaching them anything, but they have time to just play. And one of the things that parents, parents are under so much pressure to have kids perform. I mean, the level of anxiety that we're seeing across the Wasatch Front is so high right now. And I'm like, every kid, I swear, is in like 3 different club like sports where it's like, every day they're at practice and for hours. And so you have these kids where it's like, okay, I'm going to school all day, I go to practice, and then I have 3 hours of homework. What we're finding in some of the most recent research is like little kids, like elementary school age kids, are spending about 45 minutes a day with their parent. That's it. Like,
Wow.
this is not okay. This is doing damage. And so I think that, like, one of the things that I work with parents of like, okay, what activities can you let go of? Can your child be involved in 1 or 2 activities during the week? And the rest of the time, like, they need to be a kid and they need to figure out what to do when they feel bored and how to create and problem solve and how to get along with their siblings, even though they're driving you bonkers, like what can you give up so that we can, you know, it's kind of like putting that release valve on your crock pot, like on
Yeah.
your pressure cooker, right?
Mhm.
Like, how can we bring down the pressure that you're facing and that your kids are facing? And, and I'm a big fan of parents opting out of homework, especially with little kids. I was one of those parents, and I'm sure my teachers, did not necessarily appreciate that. But I was like, we're not doing this.
Yeah.
And research shows it's actually not beneficial. Like your kids aren't learning anything more by having an hour of busy work to do. That doesn't mean that you replace that with like the TV babysitter. Um, but figuring out how to bring some quality time back in and some time to be bored and some time to go get messy and make mistakes and learn from them
Yeah.
and the spaces that you finally, you actually have some safety in there to do that. Like if we don't do this for this generation coming up, like they are going to be at a disadvantage when they're grown-ups and running the country.
How do you help a parent navigate that they need time to play, they need less structure, they need to be able to just do their thing, But that turns into 7 hours on YouTube or gaming, or the perception of a waste and
Mhm.
I mean, when my kids are a couple hours, gaming or doing the thing, when they're done, they're zombies. I mean, they're
Mhm.
different humans that way. So how do you navigate that? Like, what is chill time and fun versus like, what is making you go backwards in IQ score?
So there's the thing, like gaming and video play, like digital play is actually, it's a great thing if you're not in isolation. And I think that that's one of the things that, like I catch myself doing this at the end of the night when I'm just like scrolling through Instagram. I'm like, I'm not even looking at what I'm looking at, but I just cannot focus anymore and I need a brain drain.
Yeah.
Right. Um, when you are a part of a game, you still are with other people, even if you're in your separate homes. Like this was something that was so foreign to me,
Yeah, totally.
you
I
know,
struggled with this with my oldest. I getting it now,
absolutely.
understanding it now, the interaction. So
And you're part of something if you're playing together versus if you're all by yourself. And I think that like there's a balance between, like what is needed in this moment and what is missing in the moment, you know? And playtime can't only be screen time too. And so it's okay to have limits around how much screen time that you're going to have, in your home. And every home is going to be different. And I know like COVID totally changed that in my house, like where we were like really structured about things. And then, it's kind of like, all right, we're going to survive. And all of a sudden, like phones are in the bedrooms and we never really got out of that, to just be totally transparent. Like I'm a parent in this too, and in the thick of things, even as I'm helping other parents figure out like how to get out of their weeds. But I think for especially younger kids, they do need time outside. They do need time to like get out and go get messy. And it is a pain at the end of the day to clean up the mess. I'm not going to lie, right? Like
yeah,
all of us feel that. Um, but figuring out how can I give permission for this kid to be a kid? And, with the added pressures of parenting and with the realistic pressure that you may not have safe places to get outside and go play. Your neighborhood park may not be safe to go like, okay, go.
yeah,
Right. That is the reality that a lot of families experience. And even if actuality in reality, your park is safe, it may not feel safe. Um, and, and that is totally valid, and so figuring out like what your kids need is 20 to 30 minutes a week of undivided time, just you and them to play where they get to lead the play and you are along for the ride. And it's just like, okay, I'm putting my phone down, I'm putting my work away, and I'm just going to be here with you. And sometimes that's in 5-minute increments. Sometimes that's a half an hour. Sometimes you get caught up in the play and you're like, oh my gosh, we just had so much fun. And it's been a couple hours now. Like, how did that even happen?
yeah,
Um, but that's what kids need. They do need, and they don't need the most expensive, new, cool, shiny toy. Like really like getting back to the basics and bringing in Legos and building blocks and some of the traditional toys that we grew up with. Like kids actually need time to just be in that space and figure that out too.
what are those ages when you're referencing, like when you say that, what do you picture in your mind in terms of the age category of kids who need that 20 to 30 minutes a week with parent one-on-one playing, consistent play? I mean,
I think actually every kid needs it. When you start getting with your teenagers and tweens, when they're like, ew, sick, get away from me, right? They actually need that time, but it might look different than it did when they were little, right? And you could get on the floor and you could build the Thomas
yeah,
the Train planes,
yeah,
train sets or like the Lego creation with your kid. And figuring out how to connect with the teen and tween, they need parents so desperately, even if they don't want to need them. And parents still need their kids. And it's such a painful like place, like where it's like, you used to be my buddy. And now like, you don't even like look at me or you like tell me I'm old. Like my girls would be like, you're so old and gross. Like, I'm glad I have like a better self-esteem that like in middle school, like that was like everything I would say, like, "Ugh, you're so old and gross, mom."
yeah.
Like, thank you, my darling.
Yeah. That's so kind of you.
Yeah. But figuring out like, where can we connect? Right. And it's going to look differently in those phases. Um, and so maybe it is, we used to call it, like my aunt was like, I love her label, but she's like forced family fun. So we're going to go do something and I'm going to drag you kicking and screaming. And you may pretend that you hate it the whole time and you may actually hate it the whole time, but we're going to do forced family fun,
Yeah.
And I think doing something active with your teenagers, if that speaks to them, and sometimes it's being really quiet and just being present together. But they need it so much, even when they're telling you that they don't.
How much of that space, because I'm hearing you say it, I'm picturing myself with my teens, and you're right. I think that when the silence occurs in hanging out or sitting together, I tend to go into coach mode, right? And, I think you said this in our last episode together, but we had this discussion around the premise of this piling on effect, right? That my relationship with my parent brings out, my kids would call it like, well, here comes a lesson, It really is this, and I'm adding pressure. What I'm doing is using the space with them, knowing that it's rare I got to teach them something. I have to coach them. I have to correct them. Stop saying it that, you know what I mean? Just and it's coming off as I'm piling on more expectation.
Right.
So coach me out of that. How do I stop doing
Your
that?
job is not to fix anything, but just to hold space. That is your job. And so, I think especially as kids get older, it's important to ask, like, do you want advice or an idea on this? Or do you want me just to give you a hug and let you know that this is really hard and I'm sorry that you're going through this? And I think, especially as they're getting older, because their job is to be separating from us, which is, kind of the painful part of adolescence.
Yeah.
But giving permission for space to just be there. And instead of trying, because it's such good intent, right? Like, I'm trying to make this better for you because it brings up that helplessness inside of me that I can't make this better for you. So here's 57 solutions for you to do, right? Instead of just saying, that sounds really hard. I'm really sorry you're going through this right now. Is there anything I can do to help support you? Like, those shifts then start opening up the door for connection to happen instead of, Dad, go away from me, and there's still going to be moments of like, go away from me, get away from me, know, and figuring out, because it does hurt your feelings as a parent. Like, that's the thing that we also don't talk about of like, oh, your kids really hurt your feelings actually. like, hey, that's a dagger right in my heart,
No, totally. It's true.
But it hurts, and it hurts to feel rejected by your kid. And as humans, when we feel rejected or defeated, we start to kind of take a step back and protect ourselves, and I think one of the things that is so hard and so important is to have thick skin as a parent, and be in that space of like, this hurts and it's not about me, and when it is about you, like, I've got to do some shifting and changing because I can't force you to shift and change.
Is that, I'm 100% guilty of what you just described. I'm hearing you say it.
I am too.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's because we have so little control of most things in our lives. But as parents, there is a belief that, listen, I created you. I should be able to control you. Like, I could put you back, which you can. I wish you could some days. But is that the reaction of all things I should be able to control? I should be able to control my own child, like they're my child. I should be. And I know it's wrong, but is that what's internally going on?
Underneath that is, I am so scared you're hurting and going to get hurt.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's.
Or if I don't say this, or if I don't control you, I'm afraid your decisions are going to lead you to pain.
Right. I think underneath all parenting is such good intent. I really believe that, and we only know what we've been taught as a parent too.
Yeah.
And how our parents dealt with things. Like we may be like, overcompensating and swinging to like the totally other end of the spectrum, or finding like that balance, and finding you as a parent in there, like you yourself of like, who do I want to be and how do I want to show up? But I think underneath all of that of wanting to control, wanting to help, wanting to fix, there is that parent inside it. And your heart hurts so much when your baby hurts, and when from that adult brain, you're like, if you just hear this thing differently, they're like, everybody's life would be so much better, but especially yours. And the reality is like, we can't force our kids to do anything, you know? And I was definitely that kid that was like, don't touch it. That's hot. I'm going to find out for myself,
For sure.
And I happen to have, one or two of those same personalities, which is shocking. But I think like when we can think about our role as a parent, it's not to force, but it's to guide and to help and to be a partner in it. It doesn't mean that you don't have roles. Like it's not being best buddies with your, 16-year-old and letting them do whatever they want. But as your kid gets older, it's shifting into the space of what do you need right now? Because they need that opportunity to make lots of mistakes in this phase and to start figuring out who they want to be as a grown-up. And if we're not allowing for space for that to happen and repair to happen when that happens, we're actually doing a disservice to our kids, right? Because once they get out of our homes, if there's never been permission for mistakes, or they've never been able to admit that they had a mistake or ask for help, all of a sudden they're launched into adulthood and they don't know how to do this.
Yeah. No tools.
Yeah.
Circle back to how we started, because I'm interested. We just talked about, a lot of the emotion that goes on with parenting and our role in, raising children. But we started off with you talking about a little guy who's come in, who's had a turnaround. How much of his turnaround was the parent involvement in his turnaround?
His has been unique in this, right? So we've been doing like some parent stuff on the side, and he's been coming in by himself. The plan is to bring them all together.
Yeah.
But he hasn't been ready for that quite yet. But he's actually at that point where this next phase of healing is going to be in family work. And they've been able to, it's amazing how life unfolds sometimes in the way that you can't predict, but has been an incredible healing moment that just in and of itself, and they, there's been a new little addition to the family that has been kind of like this glue that's brought them together. And it's, not anything I could have prescribed, but it's been something I think that helped him open up his heart too, where he had like been guarding it so tightly. And there's something magical. I'm like, a baby doesn't solve all problems. Like, let's be honest, right? And there's something that's really awesome about walking into a room and having somebody just be so happy that you just came in.
Yeah.
And I think for everybody in their family to be feeling that it's opened up the door for connection to be happening in ways that, probably couldn't have.
Yeah.
And so some of this is like, it's not about the therapy. It's about all these things that we don't have control over, and we can't predict what the outcome could be. Because for this little one, it's been a really positive thing. For another little one in a really similar circumstance, it could be an awful thing, right? Like, we don't have control over how this stuff is going to go.
Yeah, no.
And, helping parents like see their little one and understand like what's underneath the behaviors has been a really big part of this shift in allowing permission for relationship to heal and to be created. And I think that's again, like where it's like, if you're just working with only the one little part of the puzzle, and not helping and not working with putting these other pieces together, like that's there's only so much you can do, like I don't have power to like fix it for somebody
Yeah.
else. I can't even do it for myself.
What's interesting is you described, though, I mean, full circle coming back to this, we started off by saying, if you're not addressing the family system, then you're not really addressing the broader problem. But you just described how the system really became the glue in the end.
Yep.
Those relationships became the healing part of it as much as it was part of the problem. So, I mean,
Absolutely.
is that the ideal outcome, that the glue is the system? It isn't
Yes.
necessarily your therapeutic alliance or the therapy work as much as just getting them to lean back towards the system for the healing.
For me, that is always the goal. Um, you know, in every client that comes in, it's going to be different how we approach this. But when we're thinking about this in terms like of attachment figures, like if I'm only maximizing the attachment to me, like I'm the only safe grown up that you have in your world,
Yeah.
I'm not going to be in that kid's world forever. And I really believe that we end up doing a disservice um, to our clients, and we, again, good intent, but it can have really negative outcomes. And so in a situation where maybe the parent or caretaker isn't the safe grown up, who else is in this kid's world that we can start connecting them into, who is going to be there a lot longer than I am? I mean, as a therapist, like we see our clients for like 45 minutes a week, maybe once a week, maybe if we're lucky. We're not actually in our client's life that much in like the grand total of minutes happening.
Which is remarkable, though,
Mhm.
because I see 45 minutes a week. And if they have one safe place,
It's amazing.
how
Right?
light bulbs start to go on.
Right.
And if they can find, like you said, one or two others, whatever amount of time a week, like safety is such a healer.
Yes, it is. And safety is crucial for healing to happen. And you can't experience soothing if you don't feel safe. We are not wired for that. Like you can't calm down around someone you don't feel safe with. You can't let down your guard if you don't feel safe. You can't let down those walls that you've created unless you feel safe. And, and I think that that's like where, we have that trickle out effect, right? Like if you have that place of felt security, maybe for the first time in your life, like where you finally feel seen and safe and heard and accepted, there is then that possibility of hope that maybe in another relationship I can feel this too. And then it grows. I oftentimes teach about like attachment, like all of us need one person where we felt safe and seen. And it's like having like a birthday candle, like a little cake candle in a dark space, right? Like it's not enough light to see like what's around you, but it's enough to just see what's right in front of you. And we go throughout our lifetime collecting birthday candles in different seasons, different phases, different stages. And so if you have a handful of birthday candles in a dark space, that becomes a torch, right? And you can see what's around you as well as what's right in front of you. And so when we think about this, like a lot of times, like that birthday candle may not even have any idea that they're one for you, right? And so I think that this is where, as therapists, like we need to be curious about where can we find these other birthday candles? And sometimes they come in really unexpected places. One of my little guys I worked with for, several years off and on, his safest person in his world, and he had great parents, but his birthday candle that he hung on to that literally saved this little boy's life, I don't think she has any idea, was the school lunch lady.
Ooh.
And he called her my angel. And I wish I knew who this woman was to let her know. But there was a season, and this was so tender. This woman saved his life, literally, because he knew that when he got to school, there would be a kind face and somebody who knew his name and greeted him with a great big smile and nurtured him in that way of like, hey, here you go, bud.
Yeah.
And there was like literally there was a season this woman saved his life through her kindness. And she probably has no idea what a difference she made in the life of this little one.
Yeah. Probably several.
Yeah. And
Amazing.
so I think this is where it's like sometimes like our safe grown-ups come in places that would be like the last spot that you'd think to look.
Ooh. I love it. Be the lunch lady.
Yep.
Be the lunch lady. You're awesome, Claire.
Yeah. Well, right back at you.
Thank you for all you're doing. Going to Australia.
Yes.
Doing more training there.
Yep.
So
spreading the good word.
Building the lunch ladies of the world. I think it's awesome. Thank you for everything.
Yeah, thanks.
Anything else you want to end on?
Man, I think just be kind to yourself. Like that self-compassion piece as parents and as humans, like we need that so much.
Yeah.
So
it's good. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Appreciate it.